time we talked about how coral reefs actually get built. Right? We talked about the different stages of reef formation and the different locations on the reef. Today I'm going to talk about the trophic structure of coral reefs. So that means like the ecosystem of the coral reefs. And the ecosystem of the coral reef is extraordinarily complex. Okay? We're not going to go into all of the nitty-gritty detail of the ecosystem working. We're going to do it kind of very generally. Right? So you should have a general idea of what's going on in the coral reef. And if you remember back to the first semester, okay, in ecology, the unit that we did on ecology, in order for there to be lots of animals, what do you have to have lots of? Phytoplankton. And phytoplankton do the process of what? Photosynthesis. Good. So anything that does photosynthesis is called a primary producer. Good. So you have a bunch of primary producers. Primary producers need sunlight and nutrients in order to be able to do photosynthesis. Yes? Well, they're in the tropics in a coral reef, so they have lots of sunlight, but they live in nutrient-poor water, right? So how do you get all of the nutrients that you need to have high primary productivity so that you can have lots of animals? Because if you go to a coral reef, there's tons and tons of animals there, right? So tons and tons of animals, you have to have lots of things for them to eat to support them. And in order to support them, you have to have lots of nutrients in order to be able to have high primary productivity. Yes? So let's look at how they get their nutrients. So, one of the ways that they have nutrients is corals and zooxanthellae do what's called nutrient recycling. Okay, so they basically take the nutrients that they do have, and they're like super jealous of them. They basically pass them back and forth between the two of them, and they recycle them very, very efficiently. So, sometimes when you do photosynthesis or cellular respiration, stuff gets lost. Nutrients get lost. Coral and zooxanthellae, they recycle their nutrients, and very, very little of it is lost. So they do very efficient nutrient recycling. So here's what happens. All right, so you got the green circle is your little zooxanthellae living inside of your coral, right? And so this white line right here, that's the body of the coral. So in here's the coral, and then out here's the seawater. Yeah. So you have your little zooxanthellae living inside. And the zooxanthellae gets carbon dioxide and water from the coral polyp. Okay, carbon dioxide and water and some other stuff are the nutrients that the zooxanthellae need. Okay, and they're also able to absorb some of that from the seawater. Okay, comes into the zooxanthellae, they get sunlight, they do photosynthesis, and they create glucose and oxygen. This glucose and oxygen, that is what the coral needs. So they give it to the coral. Coral takes that, does cellular respiration, turns it back into carbon dioxide and water, and gives it back. All right, and they basically keep this like little circle here and pass these nutrients back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and almost none of it ever gets lost. Does that make sense? Okay, so they do very, very efficient nutrient recycling. So they hang on to the nutrients that they do have. There are other types of things that have symbiotic zooxanthellae or algae or bacteria, and they'll do the same process of nutrient recycling like a coral and a zooxanthellae will. So anything that has a symbiotic relationship on the reef, and we chose to one with that, they will they'll do nutrient recycling. You also get nutrients that get brought to the reef by other animals and fish that will actually shelter on the reef during the day, and then they leave at night and they feed somewhere else, not on the reef. And then when they come back during the day to hide, they poop. And that poop is nutrients. And so when they poop, they bring those nutrients from another place because they didn't feed on the reef. They bring it back and give nutrients to the reef. All right, so fish and other animals that leave and then come back and poop give the reef nutrients. Make sense? Chicken poop, right? We put like chicken poop as fertilizer on our plants and stuff where you can. So that's just an example to show you that poop is actually fertilizer, basically. Okay. So brings nutrients. So this whole lovely process of nutrient recycling is wonderful and lovely. However, it's very efficient, but sometimes nutrients do get lost. So it's not 100% always recycled. And so they do have to have some way to get other nutrients other than the fish poop. And some of the ways that they do that is actually the reef providing some of its own nutrients in the form of nitrogen fixation. Okay, basically, one of the nutrients that primary producers need is nitrogen in the form of like a nitrate or a nitrite, and that's fertilizer for them to grow. And so you have to take nitrogen gas and put it into that form that is actually usable by primary producers. And there's a very limited amount of things that have the ability to do that. And cyanobacteria that live on the reef are one of those things that have the ability to take nitrogen gas and turn it into a nitrate or a nitrite, which is able to be used by the primary producers. So the reef does have some ability, because of the cyanobacteria, to provide some of the nutrients that it needs. Does that make sense? Okay. We also have currents. So currents will bring in other nutrients as well. So even though the water is very nutrient poor, a little bit over a long time adds up. And if the current is strong, okay, it's going to occur faster. Right? Lots of more nutrients will come faster. And they also bring the zooplankton that come in that help to feed like the filter feeders and stuff like that live on the reef. We also have other larger animals that will visit reefs for whatever reason, to eat or to get cleaned. So big fish, seabirds, dolphins, turtles, okay, stuff like that, whales even sometimes. And when they come to the reef, they will poop again as well, and they'll release nutrients onto the reef. Yeah? Okay, so lots of ways for the reef to get nutrients. Fish poop, larger animal poop, they can make some of their own, they recycle the nutrients, and currents bring some in, right? So all of those ways that they get nutrients add up. And so now you have lots of nutrients, lots of sunlight, and you can have high primary productivity. Does that make sense? Okay, so lots and lots of primary productivity. The types of things that are doing that primary productivity is the zooxanthellae, right, in the coral, because that's probably one of the most important things to give the coral the food that it needs to grow and create the reef. And then the energy that the coral produces, or the zooxanthellae produces, gets passed on to other animals when the coral itself gets eaten by certain kinds of animals, or other animals will actually eat the mucus that the coral creates. And that coral can't produce that mucus without the energy that it gets from the zooxanthellae. So the energy from the zooxanthellae gets passed on that way as well. You also have this stuff called turf algae that lives on reefs. And it's called turf algae because it looks like turf, like grass or something like that. So it's small filamentous algae, like these little thin filaments of algae that grow and look like a turf on the reef. And we're not sure, but scientists suspect that the turf algae actually does more primary productivity and therefore supports more of the ecosystem of the reef than the zooxanthellae does. Not sure, still trying to figure that out, but it's possible because there's a lot of turf algae. You also have cyanobacteria, which will do photosynthesis as well. And like the zooxanthellae, it'll get passed on, energy will get passed on when it gets eaten. Okay. So you get lots of nutrients brought to the reef in different ways, lots of sunlight, which means lots of primary productivity, and 3 different things that will do that primary productivity. And then we have lots of different animals that can be supported, correct? Okay, so there are so many different animals that live on a reef. Reefs are known as like the rainforests of the sea. There's high biodiversity on a reef. So lots of different things that you'll find. And we're just going to go through like the groups of animals that you can find on the reef. There's other sorts of things that are that can be found on the reef itself, depending on like different species of animals that can be found depending on where in the world the reef is. All right, so these are the groups, but you'll have other different types of species depending on where they are in the world. So the first type is sponges and cnidarians. Cnidarians like the corals, but you also have anemones that will live on the reef, hydrozoans, like fire corals, which is not actually a coral. And they're sessile, and they will be sitting there filter feeding, right? And sponges will also be filter feeding. And the anemones and stuff will be eating the zooplankton that comes in, or any sort of small creature by stinging them with their nematodes, right? So they're going to be filter feeders or predators, depending on if they're like a sponge or a cnidarian. Annelids, we have different types of annelids that we'll find in the reef. So they can be sessile filter feeders like the feather duster worm or the Christmas tree worm, or they can be predators like the fireworm. That's the picture on the left. Okay, the fireworm is moving around eating other things. The pololo worm, that's this one on the right. Okay, this is involved in the process of bioerosion. So this one will actually be burrowing into corals and weakening the bases of corals. But they can also deposit feed as well, so eat stuff on the rock. Yeah? Okay. There's a picture of your Christmas tree worm. Looks like a Christmas tree, but more colorful. There's some pictures of animals you'll find on the reef, like the invertebrates. So the anemone, urchin, mollusk like a sea slug, and a giant clam. Okay, types of crustaceans. You find lots of different kinds of crustaceans on the reef. Shrimp, crab, lobster, and many different species of those. So just tons and tons of different kinds. And depending on what they are, they can be predators, eating other things, or they can be parasites. Just depends. So they'll be serving lots of different functions in the ecosystem, depending on what they do. Mollusks, you actually have gastropods like snails and stuff that eat algae off of the coral surface, which is good because algae tends to grow on the coral. And if the algae were able to just grow all over the coral, it would block the sunlight from the coral and they would die. So that would be bad. So they need to get that algae cleaned off. So the snails actually help to keep the surface of the algae clean. Giant clams are filter feeders, but they also have the symbiotic zooxanthellae like coral do, and so they'll filter the water. And then you also have like octopus and squid that are moving around eating things. Yeah? There's a giant clam. Just a picture for you. Echinoderms and fish. So lots of different kinds of echinoderms like urchins, sea stars, brittle stars, just tons of different things. And then we talked about like the crown and thorn sea star, you find them here. Sea cucumbers, and again, depending on the type, they're going to be eating lots of different things. So they can be filter feeders, or they can be scavengers, or they can be predators. It depends. Reef fish. Typically, if you think of a coral reef, you probably think of the fish that live there. And that's because the fish are probably the most prominent creature that lives there, maybe other than the coral. Okay? And there's tons and tons and tons of different kinds of fish that live on a reef. And again, they'll be doing all sorts of different jobs in the food chain, in the ecosystem, depending on what they eat. So they'll eat detritus, algae, sponges, coral, invertebrates, and other fish. So the whole gamut of ecosystem levels is found in free fish. All right. Here's your pictures of just some different kinds of fish. I mean, there's so many, but just some examples. So you have parrotfish, and the nurse shark, and the barracuda, and the squirrelfish. You also have like white tip reef sharks, black tip reef sharks, right? Like blue tangs and convict tangs, and oh my goodness, so many different types of fish, right? Just damselfish and angelfish. Go on, no. Okay. So, lots of nutrients, lots of light equals lots of primary productivity, which means lots of animals supported on the reef. Those animals that live on the reef are going to interact. And there's a bunch of different interactions that they can have. So corals themselves can actually compete with each other for space and for light, because they need light in order to grow and a spot to attach. And what we find is actually that branching corals grow faster than the massive corals. And when they grow faster than the massive corals, they block the light from them. So if you've got a massive coral and a branching coral right next to it, this one will grow faster and cover the massive coral here, okay, and block the light. Well, this massive coral is not so happy, right? It's like, I need the light, and you are blocking it from me. That's not fair. So the massive coral fights back, and it'll use its mesenteric filaments, those things in its gut, and extrude them out of their mouth and eat or kill the branching coral that's there. Okay, and so the part of the branching coral is dead, and hopefully it doesn't grow that direction anymore and stops blocking the light. Right? Well, branching coral can also fight back if it needs to. If it's like, no, I want this space and this light. Okay, it has super tentacles, which are tentacles that are bigger and have stronger nematocysts on them, and they can sting the massive coral and like try and fight back with the massive coral. Right, so they're like fighting over the light and the space in the reef, basically by like trying to kill each other. So, make sense? Yeah? Kind of, maybe? Okay. Because of this competition between the branching corals and the massive corals, you actually find that massive corals and branching corals kind of segregate themselves from each other because they don't really like to fight like that. And so you actually find massive corals deeper in the reef because they're able to withstand lower light levels than the branching corals. And so you find branching corals up towards the top of the reefs and massive corals deeper. And that's why. Because they fight, and they don't like to fight, but they will fight if they have to. Okay. You also have corals competing with other things that live on the reef. So things that don't have that stony skeleton that reef corals have will grow faster than the reef corals. And so things like sponges and soft corals and even algae grow faster and then can grow over the reef corals and can smother them, block the light. So they have to have some sort of way to have the algae and the sponges and the soft corals kept in check so that they don't overgrow the reef corals and kill them and destroy the reef. So you have hydrozoans and gorgonians that will grow over each other. And then you'll have other invertebrates that grow really fast. Algae. So algae would grow pretty fast and probably smother the reef and kill it if it weren't for things that eat the algae and keep it in check. Okay, so things that eat algae help to keep it in check and make sure the coral survives. So that's good. So grazing. Grazing is the process of eating that algae. And And so lots of different things will eat algae that grows on the reef. And as you go deeper in the reef, you actually get less grazing as you go deeper in the reef because algae requires a lot of sunlight to grow quickly. And so they have to get towards the surface, which is closer to the surface of the water. And so as you go deeper in the water, there's less light, they can't grow as fast, and the algae actually gets eaten faster than it can grow. And so as you go deeper on the reef, you get less and less grazing on algae. Damselfish. Damselfish are really cute. There's lots of different kinds of damselfish. Here's just some different examples for you. But this is what like a damselfish will look like. Okay? Damselfish are cool. Damselfish are farmers. So they actually like cultivate patches of algae on the reef. So, and they like keep other animals from eating in that little patch of algae. So they're like, this is my spot, leave, go away, mine, okay? And they will fight and defend that little patch of algae. And they'll defend it from other things that would eat the algae. However, so you get this little spot that like grows really, really well, right? All the algae, because it's like being cultivated and kept and taken care of. So you get little spots of algae, and now that actually serves as like a little microhabitat for other things to live in those little patches of algae. And because you get those patches of algae, algae grows faster than coral, and so you actually find branching corals closer to these patches of algae by damselfish than massive corals. So, all quite complex as to what grows where and why. Lots of different factors playing in. Okay. So you get lots of things eating the primary producers, and then naturally you get lots of things preying on the things that are eating the primary producers. So predation on the reef actually helps to keep populations in check and helps to keep the reef surviving. So things that eat the sponges and the gorgonians actually keep those populations in check and allow the reef corals to survive because they would get overgrown by them. And then the things that eat the faster growing corals, like parrotfish will eat branching corals. And by them eating the branching corals, it slows the growth of the branching corals down, which allows for the big massive corals to survive. Okay. And then you get small invertebrates that get eaten all the time. And so if you actually look at the small invertebrates and you see just like how well camouflaged they are on the reef, that gives you kind of a picture of just the amount of predation that's going on a reef. So they're like constantly being eaten and other things eating other things, and it's crazy. Volumes of books have been written on like ecosystems of coral reefs. But you guys get that it's a very fine balance, right? The algae grows too fast and it smothers the coral, or you know, different kinds of coral can smother each other. And if you take away the predators and the herbivores, you know, go crazy and they eat all the algae, and then the ecosystem collapses because there's no food for them. And it's crazy, right? So it's a very, very fine balance. Yes? Okay.